Hey, hi, this is Sandeep, and today I'm gonna explain you something about the attribute configurations of the entity object. So, in the upcoming tutorials, I'll be going through and digging down one more level down in the entity objects. That is to say, the settings that are provided by the ADF in the entity objects. I will dig down into those and I'll try to explain you each and every possible combination and permutation of the setting. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Here I have employees table, so I have already created employees EO entity object and a VO over that. Okay, so here is your attribute of employees EO, and here are all the attributes. So I'm gonna take these attributes and going to explain the settings, the configuration that exist inside these attributes. So let's take employee ID first of all. So if you select employee, you can select like this. So if you select employee ID, property inspector shows all the properties here listed down, right? So this is what I'm going to explain you. So there are two ways to see it. Either you can see it in the property inspector, or you can go ahead in the employee's ID and double click it like this. Okay, so here all the settings that you are seeing are actually same whatever you are seeing here in the property inspector. So I like to go this way because this way produces a best screen, and here the settings and configurations are more clearly visible to me. Okay, so first of all, this is the employee ID and this is the type basically that is telling you that it is a number. See, what happens is the employee table was already existing in the DB. When you created an entity object over that with the help of ADF, it said that it's gonna have the employee ID attribute in the entity object whose type will be of number. See, there is a mapping which ADF does between the type of attribute present in the entity object and their corresponding column existing in the DB. So this kind of a mapping is there which ADF maintains. If that is a somewhat number, if a DB column belongs to a number category, then its attribute name in the entity object is going to be a number. So that is how it goes. There are various other options. We should actually not change this because ADF by default has configured. The way to see this is that there are some configurations here on this screen which basically should be synced up with what is existing in the DB. One of the configuration is the type. Here it is number because in the DB also it is of the number type. So here it is. Now it says literal and it will ask you about value. See, here it will give you an option to provide a value, the default value of this. Okay, so when it provides a default value, here this box actually provides you with the provision of providing a default value. If you provide something here, see, this is a primary key, so I'm not going to touch this. Let's take this as an example, first name. Okay, so similar kind of properties are over here. And if I provide first name as if I provide a default first name as, let's say, default name, right? So if I say that this is going to be default name, so what will happen is that ADF will know that this is the default name of the entity object. So when you're creating a new entity object, it will put this as a default name. Okay, only when you're creating, not at the time of update or modification. Okay, only at the time of creation of an entity object it will put this as your default name. And also on the UI it will show you that first name is going to be this default name. You can, if you edit on the UI, then that name is going to be persisted in the DB. Otherwise it will show you that this is the default name, and if you don't modify on the UI, then the same thing is going to be persisted in the DB. So let's see, here I have put like this. So let's apply, we'll click OK and we'll save all and we'll just run it to see how it looks like. Oops. So here is our model tester, and if you go in the employees, it will show you whole lot of details. So we're gonna check for the first name. We mark default name. Okay, so when you create a new record, let's say I want to create a new record with this, see here, You can fill all of the other details, but this detail right now is already provided to you. Okay, so that says that while you save this entity object, this record in the DB, this is going to be persisted in the DB. If you modify this, if you modify like this and fill other details, then this will be persisted in the DB. Otherwise, if you don't touch this, then obviously this is going to be persisted in the DB. So that is what the significance of this default name is. Okay, now we'll walk through these some of the important properties mentioned over here and here. Okay, so let's take employee ID. So here are some of the properties. See, I'm explaining, sometimes I'm going to some other attribute and sometimes I'm migrating to some other attribute. It's just that I'm just migrating somewhat towards the primary key attribute to explain you in more clarity. So otherwise each of this configuration remains same across all attributes. It's just that primary key has some other configuration in the sense like some check boxes are marked in a different fashion, whereas in other non-primary attributes they will be marked in a different fashion. That's all. So here I am seeing employee ID, right? This is an attribute name is employee ID. This is this, and we're gonna talk about this. See, this will be marked as primary key if the column corresponding to this attribute name in the DB is actually a primary key. Okay, so basically this configuration, this primary key should be in sync with what exists in the DB. Okay, if in the DB column is a primary key, then here also it should be marked like that. If there is an out of sync scenario, then ADF will behave in an inappropriate fashion, or in a fashion where it's not predictable how it is behaving. Okay, so there are some set of settings which always need to be synced between the entity object and the table existing in the DB. Okay, one of this is this. Okay, now if you come over here, unique. Okay, so this unique setting is marked here only and only when the DB, at the DB side, there is a unique constraint on that column. Okay, so if on the DB side unique constraint is there, this will be marked. So this is, so obviously primary key and unique, when these all are marked in the DB and here, then obviously when you are entering the data on the form, on the model tester that we saw, you cannot enter something inappropriate. For example, ADF will check if you try to enter a primary key which is already existing. If you try to enter a employee ID which is already existing in the table, ADF will see, okay, here it is marked as the primary key, and whatever you are entering is already present in the DB, so it won't accept that, it will throw an exception. Okay, so similarly is the case with unique. It will check whether whatever you are entering is unique in the DB column or not. Now persistent, so this is marked like this to show ADF tries to know that this attribute is persistent or is a transient one. That is to say, it's going to be persisted in the database or not. If it is marked as checked, then it is going to be persisted, and also it defines that if it is persisted, then what is the mapping. For example, right now it is checked, right, and here you see this kind of mapping is there, that in the attribute, in the entity object, this is a number, and in the DB it's a number. These two are mapped here like this. Okay, if you remove this persistent, and if you try to click apply and OK, and see here, this is gone. Okay, so this kind of a mapping is gone. So here I'll just undo this change. So this will actually tell you whether this attribute is going to be persisted or is actually related and associated with the column name existing in the DB or not. Okay, mandatory, it is marked as checked when the column corresponding to this attribute in the DB is actually bound with not null. Okay, so if the corresponding column is having a constraint of not null, then here you need to check this as mandatory. Okay, and if you check this as mandatory, ADF will make sure that whenever it produces a model tester before you to enter the data, you always have to fill this attribute because it is marked as mandatory. You cannot leave that and then submit it, because it will then and there only validate, and it will tell you that this is a mandatory attribute and it needs to be filled at that point of time. Now so here is our change indicator. Okay, so why it is used? It is used see, when you update some entity object, right, when a user enters some data, when actually, let's suppose this, there is a record shown to the user. There is a record shown to the user with the help of employee entity object. Now user tries to modify the record with the UI, right? So what will happen, ADF will accept the data from the user, and then it will compare. Before updating in the database, it will actually compare with the data whether actually update is required or not, or that is to say whether the update is a stale or not. Okay, so it's worthless or not. So while comparing this, it will take all of the attributes existing in your entity object and it will compare them with all of the columns existing in the DB. So with this comparison, it will find that an update is needed or not. Okay, so actually right now it is not marked, but if you go ahead and mark this change indicator for a couple of columns, then the algorithm that I described you just now, that this comparison which it takes before the update, then it will take only those attributes which are marked as change indicator. Okay, so if you go ahead and mark this change indicator in, let's say, 3 attributes, okay, employee ID, first name and last name, then when you update an entity, when a user updates a record in employees table through the UI, through this entity object, then ADF will take these 3 attributes first from the entity object and will compare it with these 3 columns in the DB, only these 3, and then it will evaluate whether an actual update is needed or not. So this is how it's being done. And other things here are like updatable. So here you say that it's this employee ID is there, it's always updatable, or while new, or never. There are 3 options right now here. Okay, if you click always, then the UI with which you are presented with the ADF, the model tester that you are seeing, you will always be able to modify the data inside that. See, you remember that form came and we were able to modify each and every field, but if you click never, right, and apply it and click OK, and then just save and run it, so here is your output. If you see employees view, see this attribute we marked as updatable never. So now you can scroll through the record, but you will never ever will be able to update this field. So this thing, if you check this, ADF won't allow the update from the user for this attribute, never. If you check this always, which was already there, you will always be able to check it. So this is basically used when you don't want to use the user input to update. For example, this is employee ID. You will never want an employee to update his own employee ID, right? So you'll click here never, so that he might not be able to update the employee ID number. Okay, and whenever and there are some scenarios, for example, a new employee is coming to the company, so that time you want this field to be updatable, right? So you can click while new. So what will happen, you will only be able to update employee ID field only and only when it will be new. See, I will just test this, run. Here is your output, and see, we marked updatable as while new. So you can scroll through the already existing records, you will not be able to update them. But let's suppose a new employee is coming to the company, at that time you will insert new record, so that time this field will become updatable. See, now you can fill in other information and then press this button, which will actually insert the data inside the DB. Okay, so this is about updatable. And refresh after. See, uh, there are two options here, update and insert, right? So what will happen is that when there are some scenarios in which after persisting the changes, after persisting the updates in the DB, you would want some attributes to get refreshed. For example, let's say there is an attribute which has a timestamp. Okay, so when that let's suppose there is a table in which there is a column holding timestamp. Okay, so what will happen is that some trigger at the back end is actually modifying that column, recording that at what point of time an update was made. Okay, so at that point of time, whenever you persist the data from the area, from the entity object, from the user, if suppose some user is taken by the area from the user, and then it persists that entity object in the DB, then there will be one column which will be mapped to that timestamp column, right? So at that point of time, you would want that to get refreshed. In that scenario, you would check this refresh after update. So what will happen is that, let's suppose there is this timestamp column, okay, and after persisting the changes to the DB, a trigger would actually run in the DB, and which would update the column, that column which corresponds to this attribute, and will populate the timestamp on which it was modified. So after that, this entity object would need to get refreshed in order to get the latest data from the DB. So in that case, this can be useful. And similarly, there is refresh after insert. So this is basically used, so let's say there are some employees, right? So employee ID basically is generated out of a sequence existing in the DB. So at that point of time, when employee ID is generated with the help of DB sequence existing in the DB, you would not want the user to enter the employee ID. You would always want him to enter other details like email, last name and first name and other details, but you would never want him to enter his own employee ID, because that is somewhat DB generated. So in such scenarios, you would take the details from him, and then you will try to persist the changes in the DB, in the employees table. And when you persist it, this employee ID column, this employee ID attribute is actually mapped to the employee ID column name. So employee ID column name will get populated with the help of DB sequence, and then in that case, you may want that to get the latest employee ID from that column, which has been populated with the DB sequence. So the main logic here is that if suppose there is this ID column which is DB sequence generated, okay, so in that case, if you persist the changes in the DB, and if you want this attribute to get refreshed to get the latest data from the DB which DB sequence generated, in that case you can use refresh after insert. I hope this explains you. And there is one more option here, this history column, right? So to show this history column, I will take example of one more table. So here is one person table. I have created one person table with these columns. So this is name, this is email. I don't have any constraints, just to have a simplicity. This is verification column, that whether email address is verified or not, and this is modified on and modified by. Okay, so here there are some business cases in which there will be history columns. So these two basically are history columns right now. So that will be first of all they will be created at the DB level. That is to say, they are created here as timestamp. This is a timestamp which will record that when a particular record has been updated, has been modified, and modified by, that is to say which user has modified which record. Okay, so these two will have this modified date and modified by details. So this is how they will be created at the DB side. Now let's go ahead and create entity object at ADF side for it. New just have to query it, and here is our person. Can name it person EU. So it has created here our person EU, and there is already some sample data present in the DB for it. And here, see, I have got these column, right? So this has rightfully mapped here to the timestamp, and string is mapped to the varchar, but we want these two columns to be history columns. So just double click it, go here, and you can mark it as history column here. Then it will present you with the drop down that what kind of history column it is. So we know that it is a modified on kind of, right? So there are these kinds of like created on, like modified on, created by. So modified will record what date a particular record has been modified, which includes the creation also, right? So if a record has been updated, then modified on and modified by will capture the date and the user on which and by whom it was modified, it was updated. And when a record is created, then also these two columns, modified on and modified by, will contain the date and the user by whom it was created, because modify means both modification and insertion or creation also. Whereas if you choose create on and created by, right, then these columns will be populated only when a new record is inserted in this table. Okay, so right now we're gonna select modified on and apply it. Okay, and we'll select this modified by also. So we'll say that this is also history column, and this is something modified by. It will record the username. So the main thing to remember here is that whenever there are two options, basically created and modified, right? So modified will actually contain the details of the update of a record plus creation also. Whenever you create a record, these column will be auto populated with the ADF, and whenever you update a record, again these column will be auto populated if they are marked as modified. Whereas if they are marked as created, suppose there is a column marked as created, then if you update a record, then the created on column will not be auto populated because that's an update. But if you create a record, then this created on and created by columns will be auto populated by the ADF. So this is how it goes. So right now we have selected modified on and modified by. Let's just go ahead and test this. So here is your this table, and oh sorry, we need to check person table. So here's it, all details are shown. This is the sample data which is already present in the DB. Okay, so let's say we want to modify this record. Okay, so we will just have the name as QWERTY, and we'll validate it, and then with the help of this we'll insert this. So as you click insert, see these are auto populated, and these have been actually persisted right now. If you go to the DB, check the data, and this record we updated, and this has been recorded here, modified on. Now if you insert also new record here, if you say some new name, okay, some email address, it's verified, and just validate and insert it. So remember, these were modified columns, and again on creation also they have recorded these details as I already explained you. So if you just refresh it in the DB side, you can see that this is the record we inserted, and these have been recorded here. So I hope this explains you well about the attribute configuration of the entity object. I will see you in the next tutorial.